This is Rabbi Chaim Brovender, and we're going to look again at something we've looked at in the past, but something which we'd be able to achieve new insight based on what our Parsha teaches us. So this is a pasuk Lo Yasu Shevet MiYehuda in the bracha that was given by Yehuda, by Yaakov to Yehuda. And it seems to mean that the idea of malchut, of kingship, will always exist. There'll always be a king, and there'll always be a king from Yehuda, from the tribe of Yehuda. That's a little bit perhaps overreach on my part, but it's an accepted kind of interpretation. Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda, there will always be dominion in the tribe of Yehuda. We understand that after the 10 tribes were exiled, basically what was left in Eretz Yisrael or in Am Yisrael was the tribe of Yehuda. So let's look at how the Ramban looks at these things. Let me... The Ramban says this, Ein inyano shelo yasur la'olam. It doesn't mean, the pasuk doesn't mean that there'll always be a king in Israel. Okay, when there is a king of Israel, it'll come from the tribe of Yehuda, but the Ramban is very kind of definitive here. Ein inyano shelo yasur la'olam. There'll always be a king in Israel. Ki katuv yolech otan vet malkan asher takim alecha, they'll take them away, the king and the majesty. El goy asher lo yadata, they'll take you to a place where you don't know. Ata ba'avotecha, you and or your fathers. V'nehem umalkam bagolah. And after all, if you look around, you see that Israel, the people of Israel, and the tribe of the kings, right? Umalkam bagolah, they're all in exile. Ein lehem od melech v'sarim. They don't have the trappings of kingship. They don't have a king, and they don't have officers of the kings. V'yamim rabim ein melech b'Yisrael, and this is gone on since the Churban Bayit Sheni, the destruction of the second temple. Ein melech b'Yisrael until today, in the Ramban's time, 1,000 years later, a little more than 1,000 years, there's still no melech and no Yisrael. So how can you say the pasuk is promising it? The promising is not promising it. Melech b'Yisrael, v'hanavi lo yavtiach et Yisrael shelo yelchu b'shevi, and there was no prophet who promised Bnei Yisrael that they would remain independent, that they wouldn't be put away in shelo yelchu b'shevi b'shum inyan, in any case. Ba'avur sheyimloch alehem Yehuda, and all of this in order that the tribe of Yehuda should remain with the power of transition in their hands. This is what the Ramban is trying to explain to us about the pasuk. He's saying that the pasuk says Lo Yasu Shevet MiYehuda, which sounds like it means there'll always be a king from the tribe of Yehuda, but it doesn't mean that. It means something good, but not majesty, not that kind of majesty. Yehuda, aval inyano shelo yasu shevet miYehuda. The point of this verse is el echad me'echav. He gives a new kind of interpretation. His interpretation is lo yasu shevet miYehuda, that the majesty of Yehuda that's given to Yehuda by Yaakov will never be transferred to another tribe. Aval inyano. Well, עניינו שלא יעשו שבט מיהודה אלא אחד מאחיו, that the transfer of power should not go from Yehuda to one of his brothers. Now, we know that there's nothing in the Torah that suggests anything of this kind, but this is what the Ramban was looking at a pasuk, and it says, Lo Yasur, and it looks to him and looks to us also as we look at the Ramban, that this has actually happened, that Yehuda is not the king of Israel, but somebody else is the king of Israel. Who's somebody else? All the kings of Yehuda, and the ones that became the brothers of Yehuda as kings. Elechad me'echav, ki malchut Yisrael Moshel Alehem Mimenu Yiyeh, that the real kingship over Yisrael will come from Yehuda. And none of the brothers will become kings of Israel. So this is something that makes the Ramban feel that he has explained some difficulty in this pasuk. V'chein lo yasur mechokek mibein raglav. V'chein, the end of the pasuk seems something similar. Mechokek also is a person who has authority, and mibein raglav somehow intimates that he was powerful. שכל מחוקק בישראל על אשר בידו טבעת המלך ממנה יהיה. Now he switches to the idea that the king usually has something of authority, some jewelry of authority, a tabat, a tabat, ממנו יהיה, כי הוא ימשול ויצווה b'chol Yisrael v'lo chotam hamlucha, and he'll have this kind of signet ring, which will make a signature. That's how kings did it in those days. The king signed on the declaration, and he did it by using his signet ring. V'chol asher biyado tabat hamelech mimenu yiyeh. כי הוא ימשול ויצווה בכל ישראל ולא חותר המלוכה, עד כי יבוא Shiloh. The end of the pasuk says, until he comes to the place called Shiloh, ולא yikat amim, ולא yikat, what are the word yikat? Kol ha'amim. They'll all come together, לעשות בכולם כרצונו. That they will not only be the king of Israel, but they will be the master. This is like the way the Ramban understands the political future of Bnei Yisrael. They will have kingship, they will have unique powers, they will be able to straighten out the political situation in Eretz Yisrael, and that's what the pasuk is about. And then he goes on and says, "V'zeu HaMashiach." You see, Zeu HaMashiach. What are we talking about? What's the time limit, and what's the point that's going to be expressed? He says a Mashiach. Ki Hashevet Yirmoz LeDavid Shehu HaMelech HaRishon Asher Lo Shevet Malchut VeShiloh Hu Beno Asher Lo Yikat Amim. Okay, we don't have to go into that too deeply, but Shevet, the idea of a Shevet, that's David HaMelech, the king of Yisrael, was the tribe, the major tribe. After the 10 tribes were exiled, certainly that's true. Shehu HaMelech HaRishon, he's the first king. Asher Lo Shevet Malchut. The Ramban says that David HaMelech was the first king in Israel. We know that's not true. The first king in Israel was Shaul. Shaul was the first king in Israel. We'll see that provides David HaMelech with another kind of problem. Lo yitachen ma'amar Rabbi Avram sheyesh Shiloh David. It says, I don't like Chazal. They compare Shiloh, the word Shiloh, to David. Ki lo haya v'Yehuda shevet kodem David. Because it sounds like Shiloh is the first king. And lo haya Yehuda shevet kodem David. There was no first king. כי אף על פי ששבט נכבד ונורא בתחילה, נכבד ונוסע בתחילה, אין שבט רק למלך ומושל. The idea of a shevet is not only for the person who has dominion, umoshel, umoshel, who rules over the others, kedichtiv, right, as it says in the pasuk, shevet mishor, shevet malchutan, shevet mishor, shevet malchutan, shevet moshlim. There's all these kinds of psukim that are connected to the word shevet. Then he goes on and says, "V'akatuv hazeh ramaz ki Yaakov himlich shevet Yehuda alechav." It seems to me that Yaakov is saying in this pasuk that Yehuda should be the king over the brothers of Israel. V'horish liYehuda memshalah, and Yehuda inherited the political kingship of memshalah al Yisrael. V'hu ma she'amru v'David yivchar Hashem Ele Yisrael bi mikol beit avi liot lemelech al Yisrael olam ki biYehuda bachur lenagid ubebeit Yehuda beit avi ubnei avi biratzah. So the Ramban is telling us that Yehuda was the one who was chosen, and he would be the king, and he would be the ruler of the brothers of Yaakov. So this is something that the Ramban is very concerned about. Let's go on. So B'nai Avi Biratza Lahamlich Al Kol Yisrael V'amar Lo Yasur L'Rmoz Yimloch Shevet Acher Al Yisrael. That there won't be another king, another tribe that comes Lamlich Al Kol Yisrael, Ela V'amar Yasur L'Rmoz Ki Yimloch Shevet Acher Al Yisrael, Aval Me'et She'achul Liyot LiYehuda Shevet Malchut Lo Yasur Mimenu El Shevet Acher. So you know that the Ramban has a problem, as we said, because we know that Shaul was the first king in Israel, and that he was a very powerful king in Israel, and inherited the kingship from the prophet Shmuel, which seems to indicate that he was a very legitimate kind of a prophet. And then the Ramban then goes on and says, "V'akatuv zera maz ki Yaakov imlich shevet Yehuda alechav v'orish liYehuda amemshalah." That Yaakov, it would seem that Yaakov established Yehuda as the king over the other brothers. V'hu ma she'amar David v'yivchar Hashem Elokei Yisrael bi mikol beit avi liyot lemelech al Yisrael olam ki biYehuda bachar lenagid ubebeit Yehuda beit avi b'bnei avi b'ratza lehamlich al kol Yisrael. As a pasuk in Divrei Yamim, and it emphasizes the fact that David is going to be the king of Israel. V'amar lo yasur, and it says in the pasuk that we just read, it said lo yasur, he's not going to turn away. He's going to remain the king from Yehuda is going to remain the king. L'rmoz ki imloch shevet acher al Yisrael. אבל מעת שיחל להיות ליהודה שבט מלכות, לא יסור ממנו el shevet acher. So the Ramban has a problem. Says if it's true that Yehuda is going to become the king, and if it's true that Yaakov made him the king, and if it's true that there are psukim in Divrei Yamim that seem to indicate that. So what about Shaul? What about Shaul? So look at what he says. V'ma lo yasur. You see, 1 second, let me just underline. He says that he will lo yasur, which means he, David HaMelech, will be the only king in Israel. Lermoz ki yimloch shevet acher al Yisrael. That it gives us a hint that there might be a situation in which shevet acher, another tribe, will take over the kingship in Israel. אבל בעת שיכל להיות ליהודה שבט מלכות, לא יסור ממנו אל שבט אחר. So the way he understands the pasuk is lo yasur shevet mi Yisrael. When David HaMelech becomes king, that's the end. Then only kings from Yehuda could become kings, right? So there's this. Here's the Ramban giving sources that try to explain to him that the promise that Yaakov made to the brothers and to Yehuda was that there's a kind of a permanence to the kingship, and the kingship is connected to David HaMelech. David HaMelech will be able to use the kingship for his benefit, and there will never be another king in Israel after David HaMelech becomes king. That's something that he kind of adds on, and he says, okay, there could be another king. It says, Lo Yasur Shevet Mi, how can there be another king? But there was another king. So he says, well, from the time that David HaMelech becomes the king of Israel, then there is no other king. There is no other king, including a few psukim in Divrei Yamim. Now, Binyan Shaul Haya. And if you ask me about Shaul, Binyan Shaul Haya, Ki Ba'avur, שדבר שאלת המלכות בעת ההיא נתעב אצל הקדוש ברוך הוא. Something happened at the time that Shaul became king. And at that time, Hashem was strongly opposed to appointing a king. I mean, he agreed to do it, and he overruled the position of Shmuel, but you could learn the psukim as being less than a kind of a approval. Lo ratza lahamlich alehem min hashevet asher lo hamalchut shelo yasu mimenu la'olam. For some reason, Shmuel Hanavi did not want to appoint Shaul king of Israel, but atan le malchut sha'ah, and Hashem imposed upon them kingship, a temporary kind of kingship. ולזרע מה זה כתוב שאמר, אתן לך מלך באפי, וכך בעברתי, שניתנו לו שלא ברצונו. לכן לקחו בעברתו, he took him angrily, שנהרג הוא ובניו, ונפסיקה ממנו המלכות. Okay, so Shaul had a bad end. He was killed, his sons were killed. He was not able to hold on to what he was given. And somehow that's an indication for the Ramban that he wasn't real. He wasn't the real king. So here's the Ramban is working hard to explain to us that the Shaul was a king, but not a real king. Not the king that Yaakov was talking about. Not the king that we are looking to. And he says, because he says, עניין שאול היה כי בעבור שדיבר שאלת המלכות בעת ההיא, נתאי בעצם לקדוש ברוך הוא, but since at that time the people asked for a king and they shouldn't have, even though it's hard to understand exactly what that means, it wasn't a real kingship, but it was a kingship that was denied. The kingship of Shaul was denied actually by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Skip a few lines. So it says this has something to do with Shmuel. This has something to do with Shmuel, who was an outstanding personality, was against kingship. So we see that maybe the kingship of Shaul was shaky. It was something that we didn't really count on in Shaul. If I skip another line, yeah. Elivnei da'ati. See the line at the top of the page. Ayu hamlachim hamolchim al Yisrael mishar shvatim. So what about all the kings that were kings over Israel that were the descendants of Rechavam? Rechavam was the son of Shlomo HaMelech, who became, right, Shaul was the first king, that David was the second king, that Shlomo was the third king, and the son, Shlomo's son, whose name was Rechavam, became the fourth king. So he says, well, Fidati, so how could you, what about all those kings? How could you say, Lo Yasur Shevet B'Yisrael, if we had all these kings? The Fidati, Ayu Amlachim, Amolchim al Yisrael Mishar Hashvatim, all those other kings that we're talking about, Achrei David, who came after David HaMelech, of Rim al Dat Avihem Umavirim Nachala. So there was something wrong with all of them. Rim al Dat Avihem, they denied the opinion of their forefathers. Umavirim Nachala, they transformed the inheritance of the land. Vehem hayu somchim al devar Achia Shiloni, and they were dependent on the words of Achia Shiloni, who anointed Shaul Melech b'Yisrael, the king of Israel, Hanavi Shemashat liYeravam v'amar ve'ene et zera David למען זאת, אך לא כל הימים וכאשר העריכו ישראל להמליך עליהם משאר שבטים מלך אחר, when the Jews decided to have another king in Yehuda over the years, מלך אחר, מלך, ולא היו חוזרים אל מלכות יהודה, עברו על צוואת הזקן, ונענשה בהם כמו שאמר הושע. So now he gets to what might actually be considered to be a point here, that it's true that there were kings that were not part of the promise to Yaakov, but those kings, he says, were not acceptable. They didn't do the right thing. He says, remember the Chashmonaim? And we just finished like a period of Hanukkah. But this is the point that we're trying to make. So again, for the Ramban, it's very important. It's very important that the Pasuk makes sense in the way that the Ramban understands it. The way the Ramban understands the Pasuk is that there is kind of Malchus for Israel. There's kingship. And it's important to have kingship. It's important to be a political leader, to have political leadership. And he doesn't understand really why this political leadership is denied to Bnei Yisrael. And so he says he can excuse Shaul HaMelech. Shaul HaMelech was not really, he should not have been the king. and he proved himself to be unacceptable, then the king's descendant of the tribe of Yehuda also were not the kings of Israel proper. And that leaves him one group, and that is Onesh HaChashmonaim. The Chashmonaim, who were Kohanim, and became leaders and kings in Israel for, as the Rambam says, about 200 years. V'zeh ya Onesh HaChashmonaim, shemalchu b'bayit sheni, they were the kings in the Second Temple period. Ki hayu chasidei elyon. This is what he says. Before I tell you anything about them, I want you to know hayu chasidei elyon. They were superior personalities, something special. V'ilmalei heim nishtakchu HaTorah v'hamitzvot ilmaleihem. And they were the ones who caused the memory of Torah and mitzvot. Without them, it would all have been forgiven. We don't know exactly what he's talking about. And it doesn't seem that that was true for 200 years, but that's what the Ramban says, HaTorah v'hamitzvot miYisrael. V'afal pi kein. And in spite of all of that, na'enshu onesh gadol. In spite of the fact that they saved Torah and mitzvot, na'enshu onesh gadol, they were punished severely. Hi'arbat b'nei Chashmonaim, hi'azakein, 4 sons of the old man, Hashmonai, achasidim hamolchim ze'achar zeh im kol gvuratam. They saved the Hashmonaim. The sons became king one after the other. V'tzlachtem v'hatzlachatam naflu biyad oivehem b'cherev. They also were killed. Which according to the Ramban sounds like it means it was bad. And therefore they did something wrong. And the punishment came to these sons of Matityahu, Lama Shachlu Shamru Azal, Kol Man Amar Mibeit Chashmonai Katina, Abduhu, everybody who comes from the house of Chashmonaim is like an eved, somebody who can't pay his debts. Abdahu she nichretu kulam ba'avon hazeh. They were all destroyed in this matter. How were they destroyed? Well, they were killed. All the sons of Matityahu were killed, and they didn't have any respite. V'afal pi shaya bizera Shimon Onish bin Tzdukim, and even though there was some sort of clarity with the people of the Tzdukim, the ones who had learned the Torah in a different way, I will call Zera Matityahu Vashmonai Atzadik Lo Avru Ela Ba'avur Zeh. They weren't destroyed for this reason. Shemalchu v'lo ayu mizera Yehuda mebeit David v'asiru hashevet hamechokek legamrei. Shevet hamechokek legamrei. So if I had to summarize, I mean, we left out a few lines, but if I have to summarize the position of the Ramban when it comes to the Chashmonaim, the Ramban said there's a certain lack of clarity. We know that we are supposed to be the people in charge. We're supposed to have the majesty that comes from Hashem. We know that Shaul didn't have it, and we know that the various kings of Yehuda after Rechavam, they also didn't have it. And we know now that the Chashmonaim didn't have it. So according to the Ramban, the Pshat in the Pasuk is Lo Yasur Shevet B'Yisrael, but it looks like they are going to be Yasur Shevet B'Yisrael. It looks like Shaul will become king. It looks like the children of Rechavam will become king. It looks like the Chashmonaim will become king. But it's not a contradiction, because their kingship was faulted. Their kingship was not the kind of kingship which has lasting value, and that includes the Chashmonaim, which didn't have this kind of lasting value. In order to end this discussion, just look at the pasuk in our parsha. Vayikach Aaron et Elisheva bat Aminadab. Shmot Perek Vav pasuk Chav Gimel. Vayikach Aaron, and it tells us that Aaron married. Aaron, who was going to become the Kohen, dedicated to the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayikach Aaron, the Torah thinks it's important for us to mention. Vayikach Aaron et Elisheva. Who's Elisheva? She's Bat Aminadab. Achot Nachshon. Who's Nachshon? Nachshon is a descendant of Yehuda. So that means that Elisheva Bat Aminadab was also a descendant of Yehuda. Lo leisha. Vatelid lo et Adav et Tamar. Et Itamar. Look again at the pasuk. Vayikach Aaron et Elisheva bat Aminadab. So Aaron is the Kohen. Vayikach Aaron, the Kohen, et Elisheva bat Aminadab Nachshon. She marries somebody from the tribe of Yehuda. Vatelid lo et Nadav va'avihu et avihu Itamar. So that means that at the very outset of things, there was a mixture between the people of Aaron, the Kohanim, and the people of Elisheva, the children of Nachshon, the Yehuda, the children of Nachshon. So that the Torah points out to us that in terms of the families at the very beginning of the history of Am Yisrael were also mixed together. Aaron, the Kohen, and Nachshon, the Yehuda, from the tribe of Yehuda, the Isha. Vatelid lo Nadav et Avihu et Itamar et. In any event, by the time the children of Shlomo HaMelech came along, there was no perfection in the family units, even though it said in the pasuk Lo Yasur Shevet Yehuda, it could also mean that there'll be family relationships that will cross the boundaries of Yehuda and other members of the family. In this case, Aaron, who was a Levi, right, the brother of Moshe, who represented the power of Moshe Rabbeinu. So even though the Ramban points to this idea that there must have been a way of understanding the pasuk Lo Yosef Shevet Mihuda, the Ramban is willing to say that the families were not intact. The families did not marry each other uniformly, and therefore it's possible to say that Yehuda was not always the ruler of the family, and could have been actually a sidebar in the history of the family. Okay, all the best. Have a good Shabbos. Have a good Shabbos.